This is safety dealing with putting up antennas and towers. And if you're installing an antenna, uh, one of the main things is you want to make sure where any overhead power lines are, and that you're not trying to erect an antenna underneath it. They also want you to, from a safety standpoint, have the antenna such that if it was to fall over, that it wouldn't be, no part of it would be closer than 10 feet to the power line. It would be nice if I had that much room. You never want to mount it on a utility pole because you're right under a high voltage power line, more than likely. Antennas themselves can create severe RF burns. You can have several thousand volts at certain points on an antenna element. So you can get I haven't had one. I understand RF burns are not like regular burns. They're much more painful. And I think they go deeper, maybe down to the bone.
Wow.
Which is one of the reasons why you want to make sure that parts of your antenna are high enough where people can't accidentally run into it. So
Be like a microwave.
Yeah.
About that's what I'm saying, like a microwave.
Well, except microwaves are
Similar.
ionizing
Exactly.
radiation, so they are a little bit different.
Similar burn.
Yeah. Hurt as bad.
Yeah.
So normally, like if you're doing dipoles and things like that, say inverted, you'd want to have the ends so they're like at least 7 feet up, so people can't run into it. Of course, that's still
Voltages, dipoles at the ends.
yeah.
So, yeah.
That still doesn't keep kids from reaching up and grabbing it, so maybe you should have it 10 feet. But they'd only do it once.
If they're smart. Yeah.
Which of the following is an important safety precaution to observe when putting up an antenna tower?
I'm gonna go out on a limb and say Delta.
No, this is not Delta.
Oh, right, that Alpha is a mess. Let's see,
Let's go with Charlie.
Charlie, yeah.
Make sure that you don't have any overhead power lines or distribution line from the power pole to your house. You know, you got to watch out for that one too, even though that's only 240 volts. It's still not something you want your antenna to come in contact with. What is the minimum safe distance from a power line to allow when installing an antenna?
Delta.
Yeah, there you go. Why should you avoid attaching an antenna to a power pole?
Charlie.
Yep. What hazard is created by touching an antenna during a transmission?
Bravo.
Was that a Bravo?
Uh-huh.
Very good. If you're doing a tower, there's several things that you need to be aware of, and one of them is you need to take a class on tower climbing techniques. I know our club down in Melbourne does a certification thing once or twice a year for that. And even as a ground personnel, as opposed to just the people that climb, what you have to do to be a ground person, because one of the things is you need to have your phone so you can dial 911 and also, watch out for other things while somebody's climbing. If you're going to climb a pole or a tower, or even up on your roof, you definitely should have a second person on the ground that can contact emergency services or whatever's necessary.
If you hear the thud, sorry.
Huh?
If you hear the thud, then you call.
Yeah, maybe they can revive you. If you're climbing, you need to wear an appropriate or an approved climbing harness. As you climb, you need to be able to tie yourself off so that if you were about to fall, at least it would keep you from falling to the ground. Like I said, never climb without an observer or helper. If it's a crank up tower, which some of them are, and it's telescoping, and you'll have a winch or a motor that actually drives the sections up, they need to have interlocks so that when the sections are in position, they're locked and they cannot move. You don't want to climb one of those unless it is either retracted, not deployed, or the safety locks are locked in place. And you'll normally have, either with a high mast or a tower, you're normally going to have guy wires, unless it's a massive thing that's got tons of concrete on the base and it's self-standing. They'll usually have turnbuckles if they're on steel guy wires to take up the slack. You want to make sure that you use safety wire on those so that they don't unscrew due to vibration from the wind. You'd be surprised how much they vibrate. And the same thing's true, and we talked about it the other day, for coax connectors. Due to vibration, they can start coming loose. So you really need to tighten them down and check them occasionally. Over here on the right is a view of a very large crank-up tower. And then over on the left is your typical ham station that everybody should have, right?
Love to have you.
Nice.
HOA in that front with it.
You're not saying everybody has.
That was it.
Say what?
Moon break. I don't know.
Not everybody has that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that's what you're going to put up.
Yeah. You can bet.
That looks like it's a telescoping one too.
Yeah, it does.
This is a kind of a standard approved climbing harness. They're actually on Amazon. Relatively cheap. I think I bought one for $30 or $40. I use it when I go up on the roof sometimes and tether myself so I can't fall all the way off. That way I don't have to have my wife there.
Cell phone in your car.
And she's trained to, if she hears the thud, call the number.
She calls in just the insurance company. Oh, the insurance company.
What is required when climbing an antenna tower? You should like this one, Brenda.
I like Delta.
Under what circumstances is it safe to climb a tower without a helper or observer?
I would say, but I don't even have to read any of it, Delta.
Which of the following is an important safety rule to remember when using a crank-up tower?
That would be Charlie.
Okay. You couldn't get me to climb a tower. Even 50 years ago. What's the purpose of a safety wire through a turnbuckle used to tension guy wires?
Bravo.
Bravo. Okay. If you've got a tower, you should follow the local electrical codes on what their grounding requirements are, because those could supersede the National Electric Code and any higher codes. As you go down, you can get more and more restrictive. It doesn't go the other way. You can't undo like National Electric Code things, but you can have more restrictive conditions. You should have an 8-foot ground rod at each leg of the tower. The tower is typically going to be either 3 or 4 legs, probably more 3 than 4, particularly for the smaller towers. So you want a ground rod close to each leg. You want them tied to the tower, each leg of the tower, and connected together, and connected to your ground that's tying your station and your utility ground together. Either having strap, in other words, copper strap, or heavy gauge wire, like at least number 6. You don't use braid outside because it doesn't hold up to the weather. So you either want copper strap or either solid or stranded heavy gauge wire. And of course, you don't want to have any 90-degree bends. You want to have them as short and straight as possible. Because that looks like an inductor. So when you got a lightning surge coming through there, it might cause it to shoot off and something next to it. If it finds a short a path of less resistance. And like I said, you need to tie your station single point ground, the utility ground, any grounds on your antenna or your mast. Even if it's a mast, you should probably still have a ground rod next to it. Which of the following establishes grounding requirements for an amateur radio tower or antenna?
Bravo.
Bravo. Which is a proper grounding method for a tower? You're going to like this one.
Delta.
Delta.
I saw that.
Which of the following is good practice when installing ground wires on a tower for lightning protection?
Charlie.
Charlie. No right angle bends. Uh, definitely not a drip loop. That would be like a big inductor. Which of the following is true when installing grounding conductors used for lightning protection?
Charlie.
Charlie. What should be done to all external ground rods or earth connections?
Charlie.
Charlie. Okay. Another thing you need to consider, not that you can do a whole lot about it, is the possibility of a lightning strike or a near strike. If it's a direct strike, you're probably screwed. If it's close by, depending on how you've done things, you might survive.
The last lightning storm I had here, it struck so close to the house, it knocked all my overhead lights out.
Wow.
I had to replace everything.
Well, is that all? That's not too bad.
Well, at least I didn't lose all my electrical stuff inside the house. I disconnected all that.
Okay. One of the things you can do is, and that you should do, is put what we call lightning arresters on all of your
Device?
feed lines or coax.
Oh, okay.
And they're tied to ground. Normally you would do it at your where your coax comes into your shack, like in a window panel or maybe through the wall, depending how you do it. So that it's outside the shack, but it's connected to your ground rod at the shack entrance. You want to try to keep the lightning outside as much as possible. One of the things you need to watch if you buy lightning arresters off of Amazon, for instance, there's lots of Chinese ones, and they don't really list their power capability. In most cases, they're made with 90-volt gas discharge tubes, which barely covers 100 watts.
Mm-mm.
If you're doing 100 watts into 50 ohms, you're 70.7 volts RMS. So there's not a lot of margin on these. I'm not even sure that if you had a very high SWR, you wouldn't trigger the gas discharge tube. When you go to the more like Alpha Delta and Polyphaser and some of those brands, which cost 3 times as much as the Amazon ones, they will list the power capability of it and also frequency range. I know on the Polyphasers, you buy them for different frequency ranges. Exactly why, I'm not sure.
Also on those Alpha Deltas and Polyphaser lighting, some block DC
Yes.
direct current, some don't. And the reason you want one that doesn't is you have a remote antenna tuner at the end of your feed line, between the end of your feed line and your antenna. And you're using something in your station to control that tuner. They actually use some DC on the center line of the coax to control that antenna tuner. So some of the polyphasers or alpha deltas, it's only through a capacitor, so that destroys your ability to control your remote antenna tuner. So you'll see it listed as blocks DC or allows DC current directly.
This is what he's talking about in this diagram. That's one. And it's good to help for some lightning protection, like you said. if you're using DC over that line to control something, then you've got a,
So I don't have a remote antenna tuner and I'll let it put within, so I use DC blocking, so I want to block everything, but if I had a remote antenna tuner at the end of my coax going to the antenna, I'd have to have one that allows DC to pass, otherwise I couldn't control my remote antenna tuner. So I just.
unless you ran a separate line,
Yeah, you can run just lines.
which is susceptible to lightning.
Yeah. Yeah, it still pick up, even though it isn't coax, it can still pick up electromagnetic energy.
Yeah, a friend of ours in the club who's now at Silent Key had a lightning strike. And they had, I mean, it just wiped out a bunch of stuff. They had outdoor lighting in the yard. It wasn't even connected anymore. And it burned all that up. Where should a lightning arrestor be installed in a coaxial feed line?
Um,
To the grounded.
Right,
Delta.
yeah,
Delta.
Is that what you're saying, Delta? Yeah.
Back to deltas here.
Okay, so if you're putting up an antenna or a tower, you need to make sure that you're staying at least 10 feet away if it falls from the overhead lines. You definitely do not try to put your antenna on a power pole or utility pole. You're probably not even allowed to legally.
I wouldn't
You
think
have to
so.
get permission. I don't think they give it to you. You need to watch where you locate it so people can't come in contact with it, because parts of the antenna can get some very high RF voltages and cause some severe RF burns. If you're planning on putting up a tower and climbing it yourself, you need to take the appropriate training, have the appropriate gear, like a harness, tie off, whatever they call them, like we showed in that picture with the harness. And definitely don't climb a crank-up tower unless it's either retracted or the interlocks are in place. And always use safety wire for turnbuckles or anything that could unscrew due to vibration. I think just about every bolt on an aircraft is drilled with safety wire to keep it.
Yeah, everything has to have some kind of locking mechanism.
Apparently it's not working because all this stuff.
It's not using it.
You want to ground the tower with a ground rod at each leg, all tied together and tied into your ground system. Avoid any sharp or 90-degree bends. Try to use heavy wire or copper strap. And install lightning arresters close to where the coax enters, and it's grounded to your ground rod or ground panel, which is tied to the ground rod. Because when that lightning comes in on the coax, hopefully it goes through the gas discharge tube to ground. So that needs to go a pretty good path back to actual ground.
So let me ask you, if you've got your antenna up, you got your coax running into, let's say I'm coming through panel rod and then into my little radio rod. And it's not, the coax is not hooked to anything, and the cable's just sitting there. You
Yeah.
need to ground that, even though it's just sitting there by itself.
Which should be grounded outside.
Yeah.
And one way to do it,
The pole's grounded, the antenna's grounded, yes.
right?
But nothing, when it's inside, you don't have to have an internal ground rod like you're talking about. for your power supply stuff.
Well, all that stuff should be tied to a
Okay.
single point ground in the shack, which ties to your outside ground.
Right. Okay, but
But
that was it.
one thing you can do, even if you only had one coax coming in, is get like an alpha delta antenna switch. And they ground the input connectors or output connectors, depending on which way you look at it, that are unused.
Oh, so in other words, you would.
So in other words, you connect your radio to it and then it might have 2, 3, 4 connections. Okay, if you don't have any of those selected, they're all grounded. So you're grounding all those coaxes at that switch.
So it's going out.
The whole switch is grounded, right to ground.
Yeah.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So you have a little box that would be grounded and you could just take your
Right.
coax and plug it right into that.
Right.
So
And in the off position, everything coming in is grounded.
right, that's it. So
When you
it's
select one, it basically just ungrounds it.
an Delta what?
Alpha Delta antenna switch, they make them in 2 position. Well, it's actually 3. There's an off and a left and right and a 4. I think they might even have a bigger one. I'm not sure.
I don't know if I've ever seen anything bigger than 4.
You wouldn't need anything bigger.
And there's some other brands that I've seen do the same thing. But Alpha Delta is a good, reliable brand, and they're only $100 and something.
I think it's
Ham radio is $sign.
rather quick.
Unfortunately, because it's a small market,